The night she left, she did not close the door properly. It stayed slightly open as if she might come back for something she forgot. She didn't. Her phone was still on the table. Her shoes were gone, and her son was asleep in the next room, breathing too fast like he always did when the pain came. I remember standing there, holding a glass of water I had poured for her, listening to the quiet. No message, no explanation, just one call from a number I didn't recognize, a man's voice. Calm. Certain, he said her name like it belonged to him. That was the first moment I understood she hadn't run away. She had chosen to leave him behind. I never asked how it started. By the time I noticed it clearly, it was already a routine, quiet, structured, and unspoken. The kind of arrangement that doesn't need agreement because no one says it out loud. It simply continues. The mornings were always the same. I woke before them not because I had to, but because the house felt different in those early hours. Still, predictable, safe in a way that disappeared once the day began. I would check his room first. The door stayed slightly open at night. He didn't like it fully closed. I learned that without him ever telling me directly. Small things like that were never explained. They revealed themselves slowly through repetition. He was usually awake when I looked in, not moving. Just watching the ceiling, breathing carefully as if each breath required attention. "Water," I would ask quietly. He would nod. His voice was often too soft in the mornings. Some days he didn't use it at all. I never pushed him to speak. In the kitchen, I would prepare what he could manage that day. The doctors had given instructions, but those instructions changed depending on how his body responded. There was no fixed rule, only adjustments. I learned to read those adjustments, the way he held his stomach, the pauses between his breaths, the way his eyes followed movement more slowly when the pain was building. None of this was written anywhere, but it was consistent. By the time she woke up, everything would already be in place. She didn't ask how it was done. She didn't need to. She would walk into the kitchen, glance once at the table, then at him, measuring something silently. Her expression never changed much. Not cold, not warm, just controlled. "Did he take his medication?" she would ask. "Yes." She would nod. That was usually the end of it. There was no conversation about the night, even if it had been difficult. No discussion about what might need to change. The routine continued forward, not backward. I understood that without being told. She handled the official parts, the hospital visits, the paperwork, the conversations with doctors where decisions were made in careful, technical language. I stayed present but not involved. If I was in the room, I stood slightly behind. Not hidden but not positioned to be addressed. When questions were asked, they were directed at her. When answers were given, they came from her. That was the structure. At home, it was different, but not entirely. She made the decisions. I carried them out. If an appointment was scheduled, I made sure everything was ready. If medication needed to be tracked, I tracked it. If something was missing, I replaced it before it became a problem. None of this was assigned. It simply settled that way. There were moments when I thought about asking her to explain things more clearly. Not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to hear it from her directly. To confirm that what I was doing was what she intended. But each time the moment passed, she always seemed tired in a way that didn't invite questions. Not physical exhaustion, something quieter, more contained. Like she was holding her attention somewhere else, even when she was standing in front of us. I noticed it, but I didn't interfere. Trust in our house was not spoken about. It was assumed through function. She trusted that things would be handled. I trusted that what she said was enough. There was no space for disagreement because there was no open discussion. Even when something felt slightly off, it was easier to adjust than to question. He depended on that stability. I saw it in the way he watched both of us, not constantly, but carefully. As if he was learning how the day would unfold based on small signals. A tone of voice, A pause, a look that lasted a second too long. If those signals changed even slightly, he noticed. So I kept mine steady. When she left the house, which was often necessary, I remained with him. Those hours were quieter, simpler. He spoke a little more when it was just the two of us. Not about anything significant, just observations, questions about small things, things that didn't require decisions. I answered in the same way each time. Calm, direct, no uncertainty, it seemed to help. When she returned, the balance shifted back immediately. Not dramatically, just enough to be felt. She resumed her place without announcement. I stepped back without being told. That was how it worked. There was no conflict in it, no visible strain. From the outside, it would have looked stable, functional, even supportive. And for a long time, I believed that was enough, because nothing had broken yet. Nothing had been said that couldn't be taken back. Nothing had been left behind. Not yet. The first change was not obvious. It did not arrive as a single moment or a clear shift. It was quieter than that. Something that settled into the routine without interrupting it. If I had not been paying attention, I might not have noticed at all. She began leaving the house more often. At first, it made sense. There were always reasons to go out, appointments, errands, calls that needed privacy. I did not question it because I had no reason to. Her responsibilities were larger than mine. That was how it had always been, but the timing started to change. She would leave later in the evening after everything had already been settled, after his medication was taken, after he had fallen asleep. The hours when the house usually stayed still. "I won't be long," she would say. The first few times, she returned within an hour, quietly, without explanation. I never asked where she had been. It wasn't my place. Over time, the pattern stretched. An hour became 2, then 3. Then there were nights when I fell asleep before she came back, and I would only realize it in the morning when I saw her shoes by the door, placed carefully as if to avoid attention. Nothing was said. The routine in the morning remained the same. She moved through it without hesitation, as if the night had not existed at all. I followed that lead. If she did not acknowledge it, neither did I, but something in the house felt slightly different. Not unstable, just thinner. As if the structure was still standing, but something underneath it had shifted a few inches out of place. He noticed it too, not directly, not in a way he could explain, but his questions began to change. "Where did she go?" he asked once, his voice low, almost careful. "Out," I said. "For what?" "I don't know." He accepted the answer, but not fully. I could see it in the way he held onto the question a little longer than necessary, as if waiting for something more. I didn't give it to him. It wasn't that I didn't want to, I just didn't have anything certain to offer. And uncertainty in that house was something we both avoided. The medical routines began to shift in small ways. An appointment was rescheduled, then another. At first, she explained it. "They changed the timing," she said once without looking at me. "Okay." But later, there were no explanations. I noticed a prescription that should have been refilled sitting empty for longer than usual. I replaced it without mentioning it. A follow-up visit that had been discussed was never brought up again. I checked the paperwork quietly. There was no new date written. Still, I said nothing. It was easier to correct the gaps than to question why they were there. Her phone became part of the pattern. It had always been present, but now it held her attention differently. She kept it closer, face down on the table. Screen dimmed quickly when a message appeared. Once late at night, I saw the light from it in the hallway, a soft glow under her door. Her voice followed, low and controlled. I couldn't hear the words, only the tone. It was different, not strained, not tired, lighter. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, then walked back to my room without making a sound. The next morning, nothing had changed. She moved through the routine with the same precision. The same distance. If she noticed that I had heard anything, she did not show it. There were moments when I considered asking, not directly, just something simple. Are things okay? But the question never left my mouth. I already knew what the answer would be. Yes. And that would be the end of it, because in our house, answers were not invitations for more questions. They were conclusions, so I adjusted instead. I began paying closer attention to the details I had ignored before. The timing of her movements, the gaps between what was said and what was done, not to confront, just to understand. The more I noticed, the more consistent the inconsistencies became, but none of them were strong enough on their own. Each one could be explained, dismissed, reframed as something else. Stress, fatigue, circumstance. That was what I told myself. That was what made it easier to remain quiet. Still, something had changed, not enough to break anything, but enough that I stopped assuming everything was as it seemed. And once that assumption was gone, it did not return. The first time she did not come back at all, there was no explanation waiting in the morning. Her shoes were not by the door. Her room was empty in a way that felt intentional, not temporary. The bed was untouched. The light was off. There was no sign that she had returned at any point during the night. I stood in the hallway for a moment longer than necessary, not moving, as if something might correct itself if I waited. It didn't. From his room, I could hear his breathing. Uneven, faster than usual, I went to him first. He was awake, staring at the ceiling again, his eyes following nothing in particular. "Water?" I asked. He nodded. His voice, when it came, was thinner than usual. "She didn't come back." It wasn't a question. "No," I said. He didn't respond after that. He just turned his head slightly toward the wall, as if that was enough to end the conversation. The morning moved forward without her. Everything that usually belonged to her remained undone unless I stepped into it. The medication schedule. The call that was supposed to be made to confirm his next appointment. The documents left on the table that had not been reviewed. I handled them one by one, not because I was replacing her, but because there was no one else to do it. When she returned, it was late afternoon. She walked in quietly, the same way she always did, placing her shoes near the door with care. There was no urgency in her movements, no visible acknowledgement that anything had been disrupted. "You didn't come back," I said. It was the first time I had stated something directly. She paused for a fraction of a second, then continued past me. "I had something to take care of." Her tone was even, controlled, final. "What kind of something?" She looked at me then, not sharply, but with a kind of measured patience. "Something that didn't involve you." The words were not aggressive. They didn't need to be. They were precise enough. I nodded once. That was the end of it, but the pattern did not stop. It expanded. There were more nights like that, some with short absences, others where she did not return at all. The explanations, when they came, were brief and inconsistent. An emergency. A delay. "I told you I might be late." Sometimes she said nothing. I began noticing the contradictions. A reason given one day that did not align with what had been said the day before. Details that shifted slightly each time they were mentioned, as if they were being adjusted to fit the moment rather than recalled. I didn't point them out. I just remembered them. The financial changes came next. At first, it was small. A withdrawal that I did not recognize. Then another, slightly larger. The account we used for his medical expenses showed movement that didn't match any recent bills or prescriptions. I checked the records carefully. The dates did not align with any hospital visits. The amounts were inconsistent with standard costs. Still, I said nothing. I replaced what needed to be replaced, covered what needed to be covered, not because I agreed with it, but because the alternative would have created a gap I wasn't willing to leave open. There were other details. Subtle but consistent. A receipt left in the pocket of her jacket from a place she had never mentioned. A brand of coffee she did not drink appearing in the kitchen, used once, then left untouched. Changes in her appearance that were small enough to overlook if you weren't paying attention. A different way of tying her hair. Clothes that did not match the usual pattern of practicality she followed. None of it was proof, but together, it formed something that was difficult to ignore. The moment that stayed with me happened late one night. She was in the next room speaking on the phone again. This time the door was not fully closed. I wasn't trying to listen. I had gone to get water, nothing more, but her voice carried, soft, measured, different. "I can't stay long," she said, a pause, then something quieter. "I know, I just need a little more time." There was a tone in her voice that I had not heard before, not with me, not in this house, not tired, not controlled, relieved. I stood there for a moment, the glass still in my hand, then turned back without making a sound. In the morning, she moved through the routine as if nothing had happened. I watched her more carefully then, not openly, not in a way she could notice, just enough to confirm what I was beginning to understand. The inconsistencies were no longer isolated. They were connected. And whatever they pointed to, it was no longer something distant or abstract. It was already inside the structure of our lives, unspoken. But present, I chose the moment carefully, not because I expected a different outcome, but because I understood how easily a conversation could be redirected if it began at the wrong time. He was asleep. The house was quiet in the way it only became after everything had been managed for the night. There were no immediate responsibilities left to interrupt us. No reason to delay. She was in the kitchen, standing by the counter, looking at her phone. I didn't approach immediately. I waited long enough for her to notice that I was there without announcing it. When she finally looked up, her expression didn't change. "Yes." It wasn't a question, it was an acknowledgement. "You've been gone a lot," I said. There was no accusation in my voice, just a statement. She held my gaze for a moment, then placed her phone face down on the counter. "I have things to take care of." "You're not saying what they are." A pause, then a small shift in her posture, not defensive, adjusted. "I don't need to explain everything I do. I'm not asking for everything." "Then what are you asking for?" There was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty. I considered the question even though I already knew the answer. "Consistency," I said. "Things aren't lining up." Her expression changed then, but only slightly. Not enough to draw attention if someone wasn't looking for it. "In what way?" "The appointments, the schedule, the money." She let out a quiet breath, almost like a contained exhale of patience. "You're keeping track of my decisions now. I'm keeping track of what affects him. That's my responsibility." "I know." "Then why are you involving yourself like this?" The shift was subtle, but it was there. The focus had moved, not onto what I had observed, but onto my role in observing it. "I'm already involved," I said, "because I allow it." The words were calm, measured, controlled, but they landed with precision. "This is my home," she continued. "My child, my decisions." There was no emphasis in her voice, no raised tone. She didn't need it. "I'm not taking that away from you," I said. "It sounds like you are." "That's not what I said. It's what you're implying." I didn't respond immediately. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I could feel the structure of the conversation shifting further away from what I had intended. She stepped around me, moving toward the sink, creating space without asking for it. "If you're stressed," she said, turning on the water, "that's understandable. This situation isn't easy." The words were neutral, reasonable, but they didn't match what was happening. "I'm not stressed," I said. "Then why are you questioning things that don't concern you?" "They do concern me." "How?" The question was simple, direct, and it placed me in a position that required justification. I paused. Long enough for the silence to settle between us. "He depends on both of us," I said finally. She turned off the water, drying her hands slowly before facing me again. "No," she said. "He depends on me." There was no hesitation. "You help, that's all." The distinction was clear, deliberate. And if I choose to handle things differently, she continued, that's my decision. Even if it affects him. It doesn't. It already has. That was the first time my tone shifted, even slightly. Not raised, not emotional, just firmer, she noticed. Her expression tightened for a fraction of a second, then returned to its previous calm. You're overanalyzing small changes, she said. That's what this is. The appointments have been rescheduled. That happens. The medication is under control. The money is being used where it's needed. Each response came quickly, cleanly, no room left between them, as if they had been prepared in advance. I could feel the conversation closing. Not because I had run out of questions, but because she had decided there would be no more answers. You're creating problems where there aren't any, she added. I looked at her for a moment longer, trying to find something in her expression that didn't align with what she was saying, but there was nothing visible, only control. If something was wrong, she said, her voice softer now, I would tell you. It sounded reasonable. It sounded enough, but it didn't feel true. Still, I nodded, not in agreement. Just acknowledgement, because pushing further would not change the outcome. It would only shift the focus further onto me. You should get some rest, she said, picking up her phone again. You're thinking too much. I stepped back then, not because I was convinced, but because I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. This was not a conversation. It was a boundary, and it had already been set. Whatever was happening outside of what I could see, she had decided I would not be part of it. Not through explanation, not through truth, only through what she allowed me to believe. And for the first time, I stopped questioning whether I was misreading it, because I was. After that conversation, nothing changed on the surface. She continued moving through the house with the same control, the same measured distance. If anything, her routine became more consistent, as if to reinforce what she had already said. There were fewer visible gaps, fewer moments that could be questioned directly. But the structure underneath it didn't return to what it had been. It became clearer. Not through anything she said, but through everything that existed around her. I stopped looking for explanations from her. Instead, I started paying attention to what didn't require her involvement. The systems. The records she didn't think I would check. The details that stayed consistent even when her words didn't. The first confirmation came from the hospital. It wasn't a conversation. No one called me into an office or asked direct questions. It was quieter than that. A nurse I recognized from previous visits paused when she saw me alone with him. Your sister couldn't make it again, she asked. There was no judgment in her tone, just familiarity. She had something to take care of, I said. The nurse nodded, but not in agreement, more like acknowledgement of a pattern. We've had to reschedule twice already, she said, checking the file. There are notes here about missed follow-ups. I looked at the file briefly, not long enough to draw attention, but enough to see the dates. They didn't match what I had been told. She usually handles that, I said. The nurse gave a small, careful smile. Well, she said, someone needs to make sure it doesn't fall behind. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The record was already there, documented, timed, unaffected by explanation. When we returned home, I checked the paperwork again, not casually, carefully. The appointment history showed a pattern that had been hidden behind individual explanations. Cancellations followed by delays, follow-ups that were never completed, prescriptions that had been approved but not collected on time. Individually, each one could be explained. Together, they formed something else, something structured. I didn't confront her with it. There was no point. Instead, I began adjusting quietly. I called the hospital myself to confirm the next appointment. I asked questions without presenting myself as anything other than someone assisting. They didn't challenge it. In the system, I was already present, not as a primary contact, but close enough to step in without resistance. The financial records were less subtle. The account we used for his medical expenses had always been stable, predictable. Every withdrawal aligned with a receipt, a bill, or a prescription. Now it didn't. There were transfers, regular, not tied to any medical provider, not linked to any documented expense. I traced them as far as I could without direct access to their destination. The name attached to the receiving account wasn't familiar, but it was consistent. That was enough. I replaced the missing amounts without mentioning it, not because I could afford to lose it, but because I couldn't afford for his care to be interrupted. The neighbor's comment came without intention. I was outside briefly, just long enough to get some air while he slept. "She's been busy," the neighbor said, standing by the gate. I looked at him, waiting. "Seen her a few times near the main road," he continued. "Not alone." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. "With someone?" I asked. He shrugged slightly. "Didn't recognize him, looked like they were in a hurry." I nodded once. "Probably nothing," he added, as if to soften it. "Probably," I said. We didn't speak about it again. The most direct confirmation didn't come from any of that. It came from him. It was late afternoon. He was sitting on the couch, quieter than usual, his attention fixed on something I couldn't see. "She talks to him at night," he said suddenly. I didn't respond immediately. "Who?" I asked. "The man," he said, "on the phone." I sat down across from him. "What man?" He hesitated, not because he was unsure, but because he was choosing how to explain it. "I hear her," he said. "When you're in your room." I kept my voice steady. "What does she say?" He shook his head slightly. "I don't know, not everything." A pause, "But she sounds different." I didn't ask him to explain that. I already understood. "Does she know you hear her?" I asked. He shook his head again. "No," I nodded once. That was enough. There was no confusion left after that, no uncertainty to hold on to. The records confirmed the pattern, the systems reflected the gaps. The witness filled in what couldn't be documented, and his voice, quiet, careful, unprompted, removed the last possibility that I was misreading it. Still, I said nothing to her. Not because I didn't have proof, but because I understood something more important now. The truth wasn't hidden because it was fragile. It was hidden because she had decided it didn't belong to me, and anything I said would not reveal it. It would only give her a reason to deny it again. So I stopped looking for confirmation and started preparing for what it meant. After that, the changes stopped pretending to be small. They didn't arrive all at once, but they stopped hiding inside explanations. She was gone more often than she was present, not just at night anymore. Entire days began to pass where she was not in the house at all. No messages, no updates, just absence. At first, she would still return before it became noticeable. Then she stopped adjusting for that. I learned not to expect a specific time, only the possibility of her return. He noticed it without asking. There were fewer questions now, not because he understood, but because he had begun to adapt to not receiving answers. His condition made that harder. The instability in his care started to show in ways that couldn't be corrected quietly anymore. There were mornings when his breathing was more strained than usual. Moments where the medication that should have already been in his system was delayed because the schedule had been disrupted the night before. I corrected what I could. But some things required timing that couldn't be recovered once missed. One evening, it became unavoidable. He was in his room, sitting upright, his hand pressed lightly against his chest, his breathing uneven in a way I hadn't seen before. I checked the medication. It was there, but it had not been taken at the right time. "When was your last dose?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. "I think earlier," he said. It wasn't enough. I checked the record we kept. The last entry was incomplete. A time written down, but no confirmation that it had actually been given. She had been responsible for that one. I didn't say anything. I just moved forward. I adjusted the dosage within the safe range the doctors had explained to us, monitored his breathing, waited for it to stabilize. It took longer than it should have. Long enough that I stayed awake the entire night, sitting just outside his room, listening. She didn't come back. In the morning, I made the call myself, not to inform her, to inform the hospital. I described the symptoms, the delay, the adjustments I had made. They asked questions, I answered them. There was no resistance, no hesitation. The system accepted what I said because it matched what had already been recorded. Missed follow-ups, irregular timing, patterns that had been noted but not addressed. "Bring him in today," they said. "I will." At the hospital, things shifted slightly, not visibly, not in a way that anyone announced, but in the way they spoke to me. The questions came directly. "When was his last dose? What changes have you noticed? Has anything in his routine been inconsistent?" I answered all of it, calmly, precisely. No assumptions, only what I had observed. They wrote it down, added it to the file that already existed. I could see it building, not as a conclusion, as a record. When we returned home, the house felt different again. Not emptier, just more defined. There was less uncertainty about what needed to be done, because I had already started doing it. I organized the medication schedule more clearly, set alarms where there had been reliance on memory, placed everything in a way that didn't depend on anyone else remembering. I didn't tell her. There was nothing to tell. That evening, she came back. Not late, not early, just at a time that didn't align with anything specific. She walked in the same way she always did, quiet, controlled. Her eyes moved briefly across the room, taking in what had changed without acknowledging it. "You took him to the hospital," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Why?" "He needed it." She paused, only for a moment. "I would have handled it." "You weren't here." The words stayed in the air longer than either of us moved. Her expression shifted slightly, not anger. Something closer to calculation. "I told you I had things to take care of," she said, "and he had something that couldn't wait." She looked at me more directly then. For the first time, there was something less controlled in her gaze, not emotion, recognition. "You're overstepping," she said. "I'm maintaining what's already here. That's not your role. It is when you're not present." Silence, not empty, measured. She looked past me toward his room, then back again. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." "It already is." Another pause, longer this time. Then she stepped around me, moving toward her room. "This isn't permanent," she said. I didn't respond, because I understood something she hadn't said directly. Whatever she was doing, wherever she was going, it wasn't temporary either. That night, she left again. No explanation, no acknowledgement of the conversation, just absence. But this time, it didn't feel uncertain. It felt structured. Like something that had already been decided. I didn't follow, I didn't call. I stayed where I was because there was something more immediate than understanding her choices. There was something that depended on consistency, on presence, on someone not leaving. And by then, the system had already started adjusting to that reality, without asking, without waiting, without her. There wasn't a single moment where everything became clear. It didn't arrive as a realization that changed everything at once. It had already been changing, piece by piece, long before I allowed myself to name it. By then, there was nothing left to confirm, only something left to accept. She stopped pretending to be present. Even when she was in the house, her attention was somewhere else. Conversations became shorter, movements more deliberate, as if she was moving through a place she no longer needed to understand. There were fewer attempts to maintain the appearance of routine, no explanations for where she had been. No effort to align what she said with what was already visible. It wasn't carelessness. It was a decision. And once I understood that, the need to question it disappeared. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I already knew what they would lead to. One evening, I found a folder on the table. Not hidden, just placed there as if it belonged among everything else. Inside were documents, printed, organized. Some of them I recognized, copies of identification, medical records, things that had always been kept together. Others were new, travel information, a booking confirmation, dates that hadn't been mentioned, locations that had nothing to do with the hospital or anything connected to this house. I didn't move anything. I didn't take the folder. I just stood there long enough to understand what I was looking at. Then I closed it and placed it back exactly where it had been. When she came home later, she didn't mention it. She walked past the table without looking at it, as if it wasn't there. As if it didn't need to be explained. That was the moment I stopped waiting. Not for her to say something, not for her to correct anything. For the situation to resolve itself in a way that included us, because it wouldn't. It had already moved beyond that. He was in his room when I went to check on him. Sitting the same way he often did, his back against the headboard, his attention fixed on something distant. "She's leaving," he said. I didn't ask how he knew. "How long?" I asked instead. He shook his head. "I heard her," he said. "On the phone again." A pause. "She said she can't stay here anymore." The words settled between us quietly. There was no confusion in his voice, only a kind of stillness that didn't belong to someone his age. I nodded once. "That doesn't change anything for you," I said. It wasn't reassurance, it was structure. He looked at me as if measuring whether that was true. "You'll stay?" he asked. "Yes." There was no hesitation, not because I had decided in that moment, but because I had already been making that decision for weeks. He nodded slowly, then looked away again. That was enough for him. For me, it was something else. It was the point where everything that had been unspoken became fixed, not in words, in responsibility. I didn't confront her about the folder. I didn't mention the calls. I didn't ask her to explain the dates or the places or the person she had been speaking to, because none of that would change what she had already chosen. And more importantly, it would create instability where there was already too much. He didn't need that. He needed consistency, predictability, someone who didn't shift, so I adjusted completely. I reorganized everything that depended on her, not dramatically, quietly. I updated the contact information at the hospital, placing myself as the primary point where I could. I gathered the documents that would be needed if questions were asked later. I made copies of everything, stored them where they wouldn't be lost or taken. I reviewed the financial records again, not to track what she had done, but to ensure that what remained could sustain what was necessary. Each step was small, administrative, practical, but together they formed something stable. Something that didn't depend on her presence. I didn't tell her any of it. There was no reason to, because by then I understood something clearly. She wasn't trying to take anything with her, not the responsibility, not the structure. She was leaving it behind, deliberately. And anything I said would not change that. It would only create a moment of confrontation that served no purpose. So I remained quiet, not passive, not unaware, just controlled. The night before she left, the house was unusually still. No phone calls, no movement. She stayed in her room longer than usual. I didn't check, I didn't listen. There was nothing left to confirm. Everything that mattered had already been decided. And by then, so had I the night she left. There was no interruption. No sound that marked it clearly. No door closing with intention. Only the absence that followed. I noticed it in the same way I had noticed everything else, through what didn't happen. Her room stayed closed longer than usual in the morning. No movement inside. No quiet sounds of preparation. No indication that the routine was about to begin. I didn't check immediately. There was no urgency in confirming what I already understood. Instead, I went to him first. He was awake, sitting up, his posture slightly tense as if he had been listening for something that never came. "She's gone," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. He looked down at his hands, not reacting beyond that. No visible shock, no confusion, just a quiet acknowledgement that matched his tone. "Okay," he said after a moment, and that was all. The house adjusted faster than I expected, not emotionally, structurally. There were things that needed to be addressed immediately. I opened her door later that morning. The room was mostly empty, not entirely. Just enough left behind to suggest that the absence was intentional, not sudden. Clothes that didn't matter, objects that could be replaced. Everything essential was gone, documents, personal items, anything that would be needed elsewhere. The folder I had seen was no longer on the table. I closed the door without stepping inside. There was nothing in that room that required my attention. What mattered was already outside of it. By midday, the systems had begun to respond, not dramatically, quietly. The hospital called first, a follow-up on the previous visit. When I answered, there was no hesitation in how I identified myself, no correction from their side. The record had already shifted. "Is everything stable today?" they asked. "Yes. We'll need to confirm the next appointment." "I'll handle it." A pause, then acknowledgement. "All right." That was it, no questions about her, no request to speak to anyone else. The structure had already adjusted to her absence. The school contacted later in the afternoon, a routine check, attendance, medical accommodations. Again, I answered. Again, there was no resistance. The information matched what they had. Patterns of absence, notes about irregular communication, nothing that required explanation, only confirmation. By evening, the financial side began to surface. A notification from the account, another withdrawal, smaller than the previous ones but consistent with the pattern I had already traced. I didn't react. I documented it, added it to the record I had been keeping, not for confrontation, for continuity. Because at some point the absence would need to be explained, not to her, but to the systems she had left behind. The next few days followed the same structure. Calls, confirmations, adjustments, each one reinforcing what had already been established. She was no longer part of the process, not because anyone had removed her, but because she had removed herself, and the systems did not wait. They adapted. There were indirect signs of her situation, but they came without clarity. A message from an unknown number that didn't contain words, just a missed call. A notification tied to an account that suggested movement in another location. Nothing direct. Nothing that required a response. I didn't follow them. I didn't return the call, because whatever was happening outside of this house was no longer connected to what needed to be maintained inside it. He adjusted in his own way, not outwardly. There were no questions about where she had gone, no requests to call her. But there were changes, small ones. He stayed closer when I moved between rooms. His attention followed more carefully. As if confirming that what remained was still there, I didn't address it. I didn't offer reassurance that wasn't asked for. I just remained consistent. The schedule stayed intact. The medication was given on time. The appointments were kept. Everything that had been unstable became fixed, not perfectly, but reliably. And over time, that consistency replaced what had been lost. Not emotionally, functionally. There was no moment where the consequences arrived all at once. They were already present, in the records, in the patterns, in the absence that no longer needed to be explained. She had made a decision, and the result of that decision was not a reaction. It was a transition, one that didn't require her to witness it or to acknowledge it, because by the time it fully settled, everything she had left behind had already continued without her. Nothing returned to what it had been, not suddenly, not over time. It just continued forward in a different shape. The house stayed quiet, but not in the same way. The silence was no longer uncertain. It didn't wait for interruption. It held its place without expectation. I stopped noticing her absence as something new. It became part of the structure, like the schedule, like the routines that no longer depended on anyone else remembering them. He adjusted slowly, not through questions. Through habit. He began speaking a little more during the day, but only about things that stayed within the moment. Observations, small details, nothing that reached backward. At night, he still kept his door slightly open. That didn't change. Some routines remained exactly as they were. Others became clearer, more defined. The hospital visits continued without disruption. The record stayed consistent. No missed entries, no delayed responses. The system no longer reflected instability, only continuity. There were no further calls from unknown numbers, no messages left without words. Whatever she had moved into, it stayed separate, untouched. I didn't look for updates. There was nothing I needed from them. Her room remained closed, not as a decision, just as a result. There was nothing inside that required attention, and nothing outside that required acknowledgement. Sometimes I would pass by the door and pause for a moment, not to remember, just to register that it was still there, unchanged, unused. Then I would continue. He no longer asked if I would stay. That question had been answered without needing to be repeated, and I didn't offer anything beyond what was already in place. No explanations, no reassurances, just presence, steady, consistent, enough. There was no moment that marked the end of it, no final realization, no shift that made everything feel resolved. It wasn't that kind of ending. What remained was simple, a routine that held, a structure that didn't collapse, and a silence that no longer meant something was missing, only that everything that needed to continue was still continuing.